Hello, welcome to today's public seminar hosted by the Oxford Refugee Studies Centre as part of our series this term on refugee histories in the Global South. I'm Dr. Irfan. I'm a departmental lecturer in forced migration here at the RSC, and I'm really pleased to be convening the series this term. This evening, we have our second event looking at refugees, escapees and migrants, international migration and the politics of naming displacement in the Biafran War. And we are really honoured to be joined tonight for this lecture by a leading expert in the field of human rights, imperial history and development studies, Professor Bonny Ibhawoh, who is Professor and Senator William McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights at McMaster University, as well as the Director of the McMaster University Centre for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. Bonny is a legal historian who researches and teaches in the fields of human rights, imperial history, peace and conflict studies, and development studies. He has taught in universities in Africa, Europe, the US, and Canada, and he also chairs the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. Professor Ibhawoh is the author of the books Imperial Justice and Human Rights in Africa, so we are extremely lucky to have him speaking to us tonight and giving up his time to be here. Our speaker will deliver his talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will have the remainder of the time for questions and discussion. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screens. You can do this while he's speaking. There's no need to wait until the end, and that way we can hopefully get through as many questions as possible. But for now, I will hand over to Bonny. Thank you very much in advance.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to the Refugee Studies Centre for inviting me. I have a PowerPoint to share, so I think I'll just begin by sharing my screen if I can figure this out. With technology, one is never sure. Okay, hope I got that right. Okay, great. So Anne, can you see my screen? I just want to be sure. Can someone confirm?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to speak on this issue because it's one that it's quite personal to me. I like to think of myself as a human rights historian who dabbles in refugee studies every once in a while. So my primary field is international human rights. And this is I call this a personal project because growing up in Nigeria in the 1970s and 80s, I constantly heard stories about the devastation of the Biafran War, that is the civil war in Nigeria in the 1960s. I was too young myself to experience the war, but I heard from family members and those around me about how devastating that was. And all around me growing up, I could see the battle scars. I could see, when I went to the countryside, I could see bullet holes on the walls. And I knew this was really devastating. But a particular story that I heard again and again were stories of the children who were taken away, of the children who were taken away in the night, some of whom never returned. And I heard about hundreds and hundreds of children taken away in big airplanes in the night, and they never came back. And I wondered why this story wasn't better known. So I do international human rights. So I looked at the history and the historiography of international human rights, and it was barely mentioned. So I said, well, maybe this wasn't so much a human rights story at the time. Maybe it was a humanitarian story at the time. So I looked at the literature on the history of international humanitarianism, and it was barely mentioned. You know, there were footnotes here and there, but no comprehensive treatment of this episode. And then finally I said, well, maybe this is a UNHCR story. Maybe this is a refugee story. And so I'll focus on looking at refugee history. And there again, there's barely a mention of this topic. So this is where this comes from, a need to look at what is an important story in the life of the community, but as I would argue, also important in the history of international humanitarianism. So I'll just, so Let me start with a quote. In a recent article by Nando Sigona, she argues that how we label, categorize, and in turn differentiate between those on the move, for example, those who cross the Mediterranean on seaworthy boats, has enormous implications on the kind of legal and moral obligations receiving states and societies feel towards them. So what she's doing in this article, and she's not the only one that's talked about this, a lot of refugee scholars are beginning to, place attention on the politics of naming and the politics of labeling and how that shapes how both receiving states and states from which these communities flee, how it shapes their attitude towards them. And it is in the context of this more contemporary debates that I insert my study of the politics of naming as it relates to children in the Biafran War. And so my argument, I have a two-pronged argument, and the simple argument. The first argument is that the UNHCR's role in the repatriation of the Biafran children marked a pivotal moment in the agency's expansion from its Eurocentric origins into Africa and the global South. And I argue, based on my research at the UNHCR archives in Geneva, the National Archives in Nigeria, and also the recently declassified documents at the British Archives in London, that UNHCR and international actors recognized this particular episode as a pivotal moment in the development of international humanitarianism, which makes you wonder why it is not more known, why it is not more integral to the history of the development of international humanitarianism. The second argument that I make is that the repatriation effort offers useful insights into the politics of classifying displacement in international humanitarianism. Specifically, I am interested in what has been described as the politics of naming conflicts and classifying the victims of conflict. So there's a two-pronged interest here. The politics of naming conflict. So for example, when does a conflict escalate to the level of a genocide? When do we decide to call it as a genocide? When is it mass killing? What makes one mass killing different from a genocide? Beyond the technicalities of the definition of the term. The other thing I'm interested in is how do we classify victims of genocide, victims of conflict? Who qualifies as a refugee, a displaced person, an evacuee, or a repatriee, someone who's been repatriated in this case. In the case of the Nigerian Biafra War, my question is who named the conflict? How were parties to the conflict categorized, and what difference did it make? The ultimate goal here is to think about this as a historical antecedent to so much that we see today in terms of how displaced people are named and the politics, the international politics that frames that process of naming. So I'll just give a big background, a brief background to the Biafran War. Depending on how old you are, this might actually have been current affairs for you at some point, but I understand that some of members of our audience today might be younger people who did not have, that much experience with the Biafran episode. When it broke out in 1960, the Nigerian Biafran War and the humanitarian crisis that emerged from it was described as the largest humanitarian crisis the world had seen since the end of the Second World War. That conflict claimed over 1 billion lives, over 1 million lives. And it was devastating. The 6 years after Nigeria gained independence, there was conflict and ethnic conflicts within the country. The Igbo communities in the eastern part of the region felt marginalized and seceded from the country. And this secession did have an impact on the conflict. It shaped the way that the conflict emerged. So the conflict itself, one of the defining attributes of the conflict was the evacuation of 4,000 Biafran children from the country to Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire by relief agencies to protect them from the conflict. This was part of a larger humanitarian efforts to protect the most vulnerable children in the conflict. But what was more interesting, and this is what I focus on in this project, which has led to a couple of papers, is the role, the rather ambivalent and tentative role of the UNHCR. We have to remember that in the 60s, the UNHCR was still very focused on the refugee question in Europe. UNHCR, as many of you would know, was primarily a response to the crisis, the refugee crisis in Europe. The establishment of the UNHCR in the 1950s was principally in response to the refugee crisis following the Second World War in Europe. And Biafra marked one of the first major efforts, a major humanitarian crisis in the Global South in which the UNHCR was involved. And so the way that the UNHCR got involved in this conflict speaks a lot to how it defined itself, and also speaks a lot to how international humanitarianism evolved in the post-Second World War era. So the Biafran crisis was unique in many respects. Unlike many post-colonial Cold War era wars of the time, the Biafran conflict wasn't seen, at least not by the major political powers, as a political or ideological conflict. This was not the Congo, this was not Vietnam, this was not South Korea. This was seen more as a humanitarian conflict. And time does not permit me to go into the politics that went into that framing of the conflict itself as neither political nor ideological, but as solely humanitarian. But what it meant was that the focus of the international community was not so much on finding a political solution, but on addressing the humanitarian conflict. Many political leaders around the world and opinion leaders saw parallels between the suffering of the Biafrans, who accused the federal government of Nigeria of committing genocide against their people, saw parallels between that experience and the experience of the children who were suffering in the country with the Holocaust and the suffering that came out of the Second World War. And so there was an impulse to engage in this conflict. Media reports and images of starving children, starving Biafran children, engendered an unprecedented humanitarian response that ultimately led to the evacuation of 4,000 Biafran children, or Biafran babies, as they were known, from Nigeria to Cameroon, to Ivory Coast and Gabon. So you see here, I have images here of some of the children as they were being evacuated from the country. So the politics of classifying a displacement. So for the United Nations and for the UNHCR, addressing the problem of the Biafran children was particularly problematic. One, it was clear that this was a devastating and a horrible humanitarian crisis, and that international intervention was required. And just to give you an example, by December 1968, more than 500,000 Biafrans had died of starvation and disease, and many of these victims were children, because the reason why the war was so devastating was that the federal government of Nigeria had imposed a blockade against Biafra under the excuse that shipments into Biafra were being used to arm the secessionist government. But it also meant that very important food supplies and medicine were also blockaded, leading to malnutrition, leading to the starvation and death of a lot of children. And so the question was, what do you do with these children? One of the problems with the conflict was that the United Nations did not recognize the secessionist state of Biafra. And as far as the United Nations and its agencies, including the UNHCR, was concerned, Biafra did not exist. So there you have a very, fundamental problem. So it couldn't treat these children as refugees in some sense. But the other point was that the politics within Nigeria was such that the Britain and France held opposing interests in the context of Nigeria. While France very strongly supported Biafra and its secessionist ambitions, the British, the colonial powers in Nigeria, supported the federal government. So you had these geopolitical tensions that I argue complicated how the UNHCR navigated its role in the conflict. So the UNHCR was not involved in the evacuation of the children. The 4,000 children that were evacuated from Nigeria were done by international humanitarian groups, the Red Cross, the Joint Church Aid, and many other Christian and secular humanitarian groups that were involved in trying to bring humanitarian relief to the children in Biafra. But at some point, the Nigerian government became particularly keen in repatriating the children back to the country. The military government at the time saw, as the war wound to an end, the repatriation of the children as an important part of post-conflict reconciliation. And so it tried to get the UNHCR involved in this process of repatriation, particularly because it did not have diplomatic relations with Gabon and Cote d'Ivoire at the time, two countries that followed the French lead of supporting the secessionist Biafra government. And so you had a very delicate political environment where, on the one hand, the United Nations and the UNHCR did not formally recognize the state of Biafra. And then on the other hand, because it did not recognize formally the state of Biafra, it could not be explicitly seen as identifying these migrants as Biafran refugees. The UNHCR recognized that there were Nigerian refugees. Nigerian refugees is the language that is used in the UNHCR records. But it would not recognize that these were Biafrans. And that complicated how it could deal with both the Nigerian government and the Biafran authorities, two governments, two states that it needed to work with to address the plight of these refugees. Particularly contentious was the position of the children. How do you categorize these children? How do you name these 4,000 children scattered across 3 countries who needed to be repatriated to Nigeria? And reading the UNHCR archives on this question is very interesting, just because there was so much confusion and at some point tension among UNHCR officials as to how to address this question. And I found these legal position by the UNHCR legal department very instructive. And it really captures the dilemma of the UNHCR officials as they tried to navigate these uncertain terrain of how to deal with these children. And central to their concern is that under the UN, legal refugee protection regime, of course, the refugee determination process was still at a very formative stage in the 1960s. It wasn't quite clear what to call these children, particularly it could not be established that these children had left Nigeria because of a well-founded fear of persecution, which is, the central theme that guides UNHCR's refugee determination process. Because while the Biafran government emphasized that these children had been removed from Nigeria because they were facing persecution, the Nigerian government adamantly insisted that they had not faced any persecution in Nigeria, and that in fact they had just been removed from Nigeria against the will of the Nigerian government, which is the custodian, which is the state custodian of these children. And so the UNHCR had to be very careful in trying to establish whether these children could be seen as having left Nigeria because of a fear of a well-founded fear, so to speak, of persecution. And so here you have the crux of the issue as it evolved. How do you now define the role of the children? How do you understand and help these children in a way that places them at the center of the humanitarian activity rather than the politics that seemed to cloud the whole process? So for the UNHCR, the language was Nigerian children. These were Nigerian children that were removed from the country somehow. The UNHCR did not want to be involved in the politics of how they were removed or the politics of what took them out, whether it was out of well-founded fear of persecution or not. It studiously avoided that question. Memo after memo informed UNHCR officials working in Nigeria and across Africa to avoid the politics of what led the children out of Nigeria. The Nigerian government on its part downplayed the humanitarian crisis. There was no humanitarian crisis. And if there was, it was a minimal one that it could address. And if only the humanitarian agency would work with it, it could take care of this issue. And so you have that there. The Biafran leaders, in contrast, described the conflict as a genocide. And as a genocide, these children who had been evacuated were obviously evacuated because there was a well-founded fear of persecution, their lives were at risk, and as such, they deserved international protection. They were refugees in the classic sense of the words, and they needed to be protected as such. Complicating all of these was France's strategic geopolitical interest in supporting the Biafran cause, but also in pushing neighboring Francophone countries like Gabon and Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, where many of these children were relocated to oppose initial attempt to return these children to Nigeria. In fact, at some point, the Gabonese President Omar Bongo warned relief agencies operating within Gabon not to be involved in any of the UNHCR's efforts to repatriate these children back to Nigeria, because according to him, the lives of these children would be at risk in Nigeria. And so these kind of complicated the position of the children, that on the one hand, they were in communities in Gabon and Ivory Coast where they were fairly well taken care of by humanitarian agencies. But even the reports, you look at the records, there were problems within the societies. You know, in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, and in Gabon, the children faced hostilities from, the local communities where, local communities felt that they were better treated than the children in the locales. So there was also an incentive to bring them back to Nigeria, but in spite of the concerns about their safety coming back to Nigeria. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about the shuttle diplomacy that ultimately led to the repatriation of these children, particularly the arguments for and against repatriation. And the arguments for and against repatriation centered again on the question of who is a refugee, and do these children qualify as refugee? So one of the key characters in this story is the Prince Suruddin Khan, who at the time was the High Commissioner for Refugees. You see him there. And he had to tread a very fine line. He was very interested in the Nigerian conflict. And the records show that from a personal perspective, he wanted to be more involved. He sent letters to Nigerian, Gabonese, and Ivorian officials stating that he felt that these children, their plights needed to be addressed and that he was keen to find a solution. But he also recognized the political pitfalls of plunging the UNHCR, a new organization whose position within the international system was still very tentative, into what was a minefield, a political minefield, an international political minefield. And so one of the points that Nuruddin Khan emphasized was that the intervention of the UNHCR was being done on the basis of the UNHCR's good offices. There's a clause in the establishment of the documents establishing the UNHCR, allowing the High Commissioner to intervene in humanitarian crises and conflicts using his or her good offices, even where the threshold of whether those being assisted were refugees or whether they deserved UNHCR support was met or not. The UNHCR High Commissioner had that prerogative. And that is what Aga Khan focused on. But even his early attempts to be involved and to address this through what he described as his good office's mandate was met with very stiff opposition, particularly by French humanitarian groups and to some extent German humanitarian groups working out of Gabon and Ivory Coast, who objected very strongly to any attempts to bring the children back to Nigeria. A good quote is the one from the German Christian humanitarian group, which states that if the repatriation of the children were to proceed regardless of the conditions in Eastern Nigeria, this would amount to an international crime. And this was a very, very kind of a very big claim that to accuse the UNHCR of being part of an international crime was a very sensitive question at the time. And this is what Aga Khan had to negotiate. The archival records show how, airplanes were hired to shuttle UNHCR and UN diplomats between Gabon and Nigeria and Ivory Coast to negotiate, often under the radar. So, and this is what is really interesting. You look at the archives, the UNHCR does not want the world to know that much of this is happening until the very end. There's a lead on the negotiation that is going on because there are concerns that if these came to light in Nigeria, or in Gabon, or elsewhere, it would undermine the repatriation process. And so there is these or back behind the scenes flurry of activities that is happening. The UNHCR to allay the concerns of humanitarian groups that are worried about the conditions in Eastern Nigeria and the plight of the children once they return to Nigeria, actually sends officials to the camps that have been prepared for these children in Eastern Nigeria to confirm that adequate provisions had been made to receive them and to ensure that they were not persecuted. And even the very basic question of, because these children had spent 2 to 3 years outside the country, how do you even identify where they come from? They had been flown out of the country in the middle of the night, many of them without proper identification. So even when you brought them back to Nigeria, how do you find the parents? How do you find the villages or the communities where they belong to? So there's a whole load of logistical challenges that UNHCRs have to deal with in Nigeria to reassure the international community that repatriating these children was the right thing to do and something that the UNHCR should be involved in. And so at last the children come home. The UNHCR plays an important role. It's in spite of all the challenges, it goes to Nigeria and emphasizes that the conditions have to be made for these children. It gets assurances from the government of Nigeria, led by General Yakubu Gowon, that these children will not be persecuted, that they will be cared for, that their parents will not be persecuted, that all efforts will be made by the Nigerian government to protect them when they return. So Aga Khan then goes back to Gabon and to Ivory Coast to reassure the French and the Gabonese and the the leaders of the Côte d'Ivoire, that he has assurances from Nigeria that the children will be protected. For the Nigerian government, this was a big deal. After the civil war, the Nigerian government was very keen on what it called the policy of the three R's: reconstruction, rehabilitation, and reconciliation. And the principles of post-conflict reconciliation came to center on the repatriation of these children. It was seen as very important to have these Igbo children, these Biafran children that have been spirited out of the country in the middle of the night by humanitarian agencies, returned back home. And this would represent the end of the conflict and signal the commitment of the federal government to post-conflict reconciliation. And so the arrival of the children was a well-orchestrated media event in which the head of state himself, accompanied by the UNHCR High Commissioner, Aga Khan. Aga Khan actually flew with the children, and this kind of underscores the importance of this to the UNHCR at the time, that Aga Khan flies to Gabon and then flies on the same aircraft with the children to Lagos to be received by head of state General Yakubu Gowon. And so it's a story that ends well. It's still a challenge because many of the children do not know where they come from. Many of them were taken out of the country while they were very young. And so it took another year or two to even begin to find their parents. One of the humanitarian workers who was involved in the process describes it as a heartbreaking exercise because, you know, what they did was they had to put some of these children in vehicles and drive them around the countryside, just in the hope that the children would recognize where they once lived, or, you know, some language or some landmarks to help return them to the children. And the records show that most of these children were eventually returned to their communities. But the larger point, and this is where I conclude this argument, the larger point for me goes back to the point, this important story, which you know, UNHCR officials at the time, one UNHCR officials actually uses the word that when the history of the UNHCR is being written, this would be one of its finest moments. And one of the concerns that I have as someone who does post-colonial history is, why isn't this right there as a defining moment in the development of international humanitarianism? What does it say about the historiography and the state of the scholarship that such a pivotal moment that defined the development of international humanitarianism has basically fallen off the radar or has been confined to a footnote in these grand histories that have been produced on international humanitarianism, that we need to recover these episodes in the global south that also shaped the development of international humanitarianism, not just the big events in Europe that defined the international humanitarianism. The other question that I raise is that it shows the foundations of the politics of naming that we continue to see today. Like the opening quotes I had says, even in the question of migration in Europe, the irregular migration, you see echoes of these deep-seated politics of naming and how it is shaped by politics. So who is a refugee qualified to migrate? Who is an irregular migrant? Who is a displaced person? And I argue that as human rights scholars, as refugee scholars, as scholars of international humanitarianism, we need to pay attention to the politics of naming, particularly since these politics affect not just, you know, states and societies, but they affect the most vulnerable victims of conflict. In the case of the Biafran War, the children, unaccompanied children, who were clearly the most vulnerable victims of that conflict. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to the conversation thereafter.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ibhawoh, for this really fascinating account of the Biafran War, which I think has given all of us so much to think about, not only in terms of Nigerian history, but also more broadly the histories of humanitarianism, of international refugee policy and UNHCR.